Our first story tonight will be related by Bob Milliken, and it has to do with a celebration in 1932 of George Washington's 200th birthday. Bob, would you come up?
Okay. That's the location of the celebration. But that was not determined 89 years ago at the town meeting in 1932, when the town meeting decided they should celebrate the 200th birthday of George Washington. Okay. And the town meeting took place after his birthday occurred, but when you're going to have something like this, it would seem as if you'd want to have quite a few people in town. So if it took place on his birthday, it wouldn't work out very well, because everything would be frozen and so forth. Then there was a question of where it should be held, on land or at sea. And guess what? They decided to have it at sea. And this is the place, Contention Cove. Now, the sources of this are from E.N. Klopper, who lived in the area, I believe over on this side, on the Surry side. He was a summer resident, a professor, and there's an article that he wrote that I had as a source, plus some of his diary entries. And I also have a letter from Ruth Bellatty, who lived over at Bellatty's Point, whose family sort of sponsored the gatherings near her place. And she wrote a letter to Jane Lord in January of 1984 that concerned this. So it was decided that having something on water would work, but they decided what a good idea would be Washington crossing the Delaware. Now, Surry doesn't really have a river large enough to be the Delaware. We have Yorkshire streams and so forth. So what are we going to do? Well, Contention Cove seemed to work out. Now, when I first saw this, I thought that the crossing would be too narrow, you know? I mean, the Delaware River. But somewhere I found that where he crossed to go over to Trenton, New Jersey to sneak up on the Hessians was only 300 yards wide. Perfect, no problem. So they decided to have it there, but then we have to get the entertainment. So we had the Ellsworth City Band, we had the Ellsworth Women's Chorus, we had the Kneisel from Blue Hill String Quartet, and they had one vocalist toward the end, a soloist. And all of the celebration basically was going to take place over near Bellatty's Point, near Bellatty's cottage. And in addition to all these plans, they decided, well, wouldn't it be good if we involved a few other boats? So they called a person, I don't think he's a relative of mine, but his name was Seth Milliken. And he was a Commodore of the East Blue Hill Yacht Club. And he was very happy to bring his fleet around the corner and then up Patton's Bay. And on the appointed day, he did. Okay. But first, I should say that on the day, and the day they chose, was chosen through an almanac and there was a committee, let's see, the Postmaster Frank Whitney, Willard King, whose store sign is on the back wall, and Pearlie Carter were the committee that did the planning for this. And then Postmaster Whitney and Jim Carey, okay, who was the moderator at the town meeting when the idea of the whole thing started, checked on, or with, Carey's almanac to see whether that year, what would be a good time. Okay? So they figured they wanted it to be at high tide, They wanted to be near or on a full moon. Well, they came within 3 days with the full moon, and so they decided it would be August 18th, which is a Thursday, but I guess in the middle of summer it really doesn't matter, right? Not a weekend. So that was, the 21st was when the full moon was, the 18th, within 3 days, okay. And 9 o'clock that night, on the 18th, was a high tide. And the plan was that they were going to start with the boat, with Washington and 11 others, and they're going to row across the cove from this side of, the Surry side, across. But I initially thought they were going to go all the way to land on the other side, but they ended up thinking it would be a good idea to go to Commodore Seth Milliken's yacht, which would be moved in from offshore. And that yacht, believe it, I couldn't believe it, was a 103-foot yacht. Now that is a large sailboat, believe me, okay? All right, so moderated, they were going down, I think it was a kind of a flatbed truck over at Blatty's Point, near their cottage. And then they had to have people, of course, park, and that's where the speeches were going to take place. It was bunting, decorating the truck, and there was going to, the singer would be there. And then there was going to be a speech by Judge Dunn, okay, a Supreme Court judge of the state of Maine. And so, when all this was thought up and advertised, it resulted in a good many people showing up in Surry and parking everywhere around Contention Cove. I mean, within a half a mile of it. And apparently there's more open space there then than there is now. And so, but they're also parking on residents' lawns over there, cottages and everything. Okay. So, then, it says that it stirred up patriotism all over Hancock County. Okay, so then in the early afternoon of the 18th, a fleet of 33 boats, schooners, sloops, yawls, and catboats, and motor launches sailed up the bay, okay, with Commodore Milliken's yawl leading the way. And then it was a nice day with a southerly breeze, nice, coming right up with the wind behind you, wing on wing, beautiful. Must have really looked good. And they anchored offshore. And I think that while they were offshore that afternoon, according to Ruth Bellatti's letter, she said that Commodore Milliken came ashore in his yacht and invited her relatives from the cottage, the Bellatti cottage, to go out and have tea on board the yacht while they awaited the darkness, because hey, Washington crossed the Delaware in the dark. So this is going to take place at 9 at night. So we have to wait until it gets dark to have this occur. So then that took place. Then the afternoon wore on, and a breeze started to come up a bit. It increased, okay? And the breeze was from the south, which is, as you would know, probably, it would come right into that cove. Okay? And however, the flagship, okay, was able to get closer to its position on nearer, okay, Blatty's Point, so that the boat with George Washington crossing Contention Cove could arrive safely. And then on board that boat was the Ellsworth Municipal Band, and supposedly the Nigel String Quartet. It's not clear where the Ellsworth Ladies Chorus was, daintily clad in white dresses, as if for a summer lawn party. Okay. They don't know where they ended up. Okay. And then the wind is a major factor that of what followed. But it should also be noted that Postmaster Whitney and Jim Carey used Carey's almanac, which I've already said, which was a year old. Therefore, the times of the high tide and the full moon were very much out of whack. waited in darkness approached, Jim Carrey climbed onto the body of the truck, festooned with red, white, and blue decorations. And I should have mentioned prior to this, they strung lights everywhere, all over Blatty's Point, from tree to tree, and also all around this, the speaker's place. But Carrey said, he's the master of ceremony. The electrician, now I said they had to hire an electrician to plug in lights or to string them, right? That seems strange, but anyway they did. But at least this account says that the electrician was having trouble with all the colored lights and would take an hour to fix them. Okay. In fact, when he plugged in the lights, he blew the fuses that darkened the point in its cottages. Okay, so lights and little lights, Washington could still cross contention code. What do we need lights for that? It's dark anyway. So all eyes turned toward the code, but nothing happened for a long time. Some people went home, but others who stayed began to laugh. Washington was not a man of the sea, and neither was his portrayer, Theodore Smith, who was a banker in Ellsworth. And he was tall and very, very thin. In fact, Jerry Lord mentions when he was a kid going to school in the 6th grade, he saw the man who portrayed it. An old man, but very tall, and apparently he had a reputation. Hey, that's the guy. He played Washington. Well, almost did. Okay. He was all dressed up in colonial costume, powder. This is a quote. Powder wig, tri-cornered hat, and flowing cloak, and was ready to embark. The colonial oarsmen were holding the boat on Solly's rocky shore, which is on this side, as best they could, in the pounding surf, and called upon their general to get in so they could shove off. But George looked at the great combers rushing at him out of the blackness, then at the far-off flagship, and said, the Delaware was never like this. An understatement, right? Man alive, get in, we can't hold this boat here all night, the oarsman shouted, but George stood firm. Suddenly another voice was heard. If you won't, I will. Give me those clothes you've got on. So George retreated to the shrubbery with the volunteer, and they exchanged garments. The new George was short in stature, and the colonial costume sagged on his sturdy frame. But nothing daunted, he jumped into the craft, stood upon a thwart, and held the flag aloft, braced by his companion's arms. Limp, Trevorgy, the spirit of '76, stood beside him, beating the drum, letting those Hessians know that he's coming. And a fine figure of a man was he. As the boat drew away from the shore, the searchlights were trained on it by the yachts. The oarsmen bent to their task, and the flag rippled in the gale. It was a stormy passage, but a brave sight. Now, this is all quotes from Cloppers. I mean, very, kind of nice work. And the craft slowly moved against the wind, its figures in the dress of revolutionary days, sharply outlined in the beams of light, until it went alongside the flagship where the party was received and entertained. Aboard the flagship, the Ellsworth Municipal Band could faintly be heard every now and then. In the intermission, some thought they could hear stringed instruments of the Nisel Quartet working hard against the gale. Well, there's another footnote here on Blatty's letter. She said that her grandmother rescued a lame man coming up from shore. And apparently it wasn't a person who really wasn't lame, he was drunk. He was a member of the string quartet. The strings of colored lights on the point suddenly came back on, and the remaining crowd thought finally all would be well. Moderator Surry climbed onto the truck and directed his megaphone toward the flagship, saying, the quartet will now favor us with a piece. Nobody knew whether he was referring to the Nisel Quartet or the ladies' chorus. However, no sound of music could be heard. As the audience got more and more restless, Jim Carrey again climbed out of the truck and yelled through the megaphone, "Ship ahoy, will the quartet please sing?" His words were snatched up by the wind and blown away toward Bangor. Every ear strained to catch the music, but only the whistling of the wind could be heard. Carrey yelled to the flagship to flash a light if the quartet was ready. A light flashed, but no notes came over the water. Finally, Carrey shouted, asking if the quartet was on board, and got a chorus of men's voices roaring, "No!" The crowd on shore had been thinning out, but those who remained were enjoying the debacle even more than if it had been a success. Moderator Carrey announced that the next number would be sung by William Powers, a black man who climbed on the truck and sang Old Man River. Now, when I first read that, I didn't know, because the diary of Dr. Clark indicated that this was a black man. I didn't know that this, it seemed totally incongruous when I read it, Old Man River, right? You know, it's spiritual, but now it makes sense. And his good voice was applauded by those nearby, but those on the boats couldn't no way have heard him. The final participant in the program, Judge Dunn, okay, Maine Supreme Court, stood on the truck under the festoons of colored lights and reviewed the difficulties that Washington faced and was working his speech to a climax when a string of lights fell down on him. The audience, hey, guess what? They're still laughing. But he gently lifted the gown while others pulled it taut, finished his remarks with plaudits, as well as the gale ringing in his ears. After singing the Star-Spangled Banner, the bedraggled visitors went home. And the Ellsworth American reported that poor weather and electrical failure at a critical time, as well as a miscalculation of high tide, hindered the water program.